Welcome to the deep dive. So for decades, serial murder, it's really captured the public imagination, hasn't it? Fueled by true crime, media spectacle, sometimes just pure sensationalism. We all kind of know the tropes, right? The terrifying, often fictional genius operating in the shadows.
Yeah, and that intense, sometimes, let's be honest, unhealthy public fascination. It's meant that the whole topic has basically transmogrified into entertainment, as one source put it. When you watch TV or read popular books, you see this constant reliance on these, well, overly simplistic old guard profiles.
Right, like just labeling them evil and savage or these criminal masterminds.
Exactly, those easy labels.
So our mission today is really to cut through that noise. We want to move past those, broad, hyperbolic stereotypes. We've pulled together a pretty substantial stack of sources here. Forensic psychology reports, recent criminology research, some really detailed FBI analysis, and even some cutting-edge neurological studies. We're aiming to give you a critical reality check. What do modern researchers actually know about the complex psychology and behavioral patterns of serial killers? And how does that data just completely dismantle some of these myths that keep hanging around?
Well, and it's important because when you're dealing with such a sensitive topic, something with such high impact, there's a real ethical responsibility. For researchers and, by extension for us talking about it now, we have to prioritize the hard data, the accurate information. We need to understand the complexity, not just simplify it for entertainment.
Absolutely. So let's unpack this material, maybe starting with the very first hurdle researchers even faced. Just figuring out how to define this phenomenon.
Yeah, because when you think serial killer, you probably picture someone like, I don't know, Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, right? These high victim count individuals. But the research, it seems like it's always shown that the definitions themselves are as varied as offenders themselves, which must have made research really hard.
Oh, absolutely. That lack of standardization was a huge roadblock for a long time. Historically, definitions were all over the place. Did you need 3 victims? 4? Did they have to have a specific cooling off period between kills? It was messy.
So what's changed? Is there more agreement now?
Yes, thankfully. Modern research in law enforcement, especially the FBI, they're increasingly settling on a more consistent, practical standard.
Okay, so what is that modern working definition we're seeing in the sources?
It's generally accepted now as the unlawful killing of 2 or more victims.
2. Yes, 2 or more. By the same individual, or sometimes individuals, acting together. And this happens over a period of more than 14 days, and crucially, in separate events.
Wow, 2 victims. That feels surprisingly low compared to the big media portrayals. Why set the bar that low? What's the practical reason for that? Why not wait for 3 to be sure it's a pattern?
Well, there are 2 really big practical benefits. One's for the science side and the other's for public safety.
Okay.
For the scientific community, dropping that required number down to 2, it dramatically increases the available sample size for study. When you're dealing with something statistically rare, like serial murder, having a larger sample lets you do much more robust, data-driven analysis on, causes, geography, methods. You spot trends faster.
Right. More data points make for better analysis.
Mhm.
And for law enforcement, what's the impact there?
For law enforcement, it's critical. Because once they can reliably link 2 offenses, even if it's just been, say, 15 days, regardless of the specific motive, they're basically compelled to change their whole investigative strategy. They shift from looking at isolated incidents to recognizing, okay, we might have a pattern of predation here.
So it forces their hand earlier.
Exactly. It means bringing in dedicated task forces, specialized resources, a much more urgent public safety response, instead of waiting, potentially, for a 3rd or 4th victim, which tragically often happened under the older, higher threshold definitions. It forces earlier intervention.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. How did investigators traditionally try to analyze these patterns? I'm thinking of that classic FBI typology, organized versus disorganized killers. That framework is everywhere, right, in movies, TV shows. But the sources suggest it's, pretty much considered obsolete now.
Yeah, obsolete is a good word. It's widely seen by forensic psychologists today as overly simplistic. It has, quote, limited utility. The fundamental problem is just that reality is messy. Human behavior is complex. Very few offenders fit neatly into just one of those boxes.
Yeah, the mixed traits.
The vast majority do, yes. They display characteristics from both categories.
Can you give an example of how that might look, that kind of mixing?
Sure. Think about an offender who might be incredibly meticulous, very organized in their planning phase. They pick a specific type of victim, they carefully scout an abduction location, they bring a pre-selected kit of tools, very controlled.
Okay, sounds organized.
Right. But then maybe during the actual killing or when disposing of the body, something goes wrong. They panic or their impulse control just fails them in the moment. And they end up leaving the body right there as is at the murder site in a really chaotic, reactive way, which is a classic disorganized behavior. That original typology just doesn't account for that kind of common fluidity.
So if that old binary system is largely, put aside, how are researchers thinking about grouping these behaviors now? Are the newer typologies any better at capturing the complexity?
They try to be more nuanced, yeah. They often focus more on the underlying motivation or maybe what the killer gets out of it, their enjoyment. So you see typologies like visionary killers, mission-oriented, hedonistic, power control-oriented killers. Those try to get at the why. Perhaps one of the more useful modern distinctions, though, separates them into act-focused killers versus process-focused killers.
Okay, what's the difference there? Act versus process.
An act-focused killer is often driven by a specific goal. They might feel like they're on a crusade, maybe to rid the world of a certain group they despise, like targeting sex workers or people experiencing homelessness. For them, the act of killing itself is the mission.
Got it. The end justifies the means in their mind.
Kind of, yeah. Whereas a process-focused killer, well, this is often the more sadistic type. For them, it's the process itself, the protracted suffering, maybe torture, the psychological domination of the victim. That's the primary source of gratification. The longer it takes, the more drawn out, the greater the reward for them.
That's disturbing. But it sounds like, regardless of how detailed these new classifications get, the main takeaway for us, for you listening, is still the same. Trying to slap one simple label on these individuals is probably a mistake.
Absolutely. That's the critical conclusion, especially for investigators. You have to accept that there's really no such a thing as a prototypical serial killer. Offenders are idiosyncratic, they're complex, they often defy these neat psychological boxes we try to put them in. Any single typology, no matter how sophisticated it seems, is going to have real limitations when you apply it to the messy reality of a case.
This skepticism about clean profiles, it leads us straight into probably the biggest media distortion of them all. The mastermind myth. We're so conditioned by fictional characters, right? The super intelligent, maybe wealthy, highly educated Hannibal Lecter type who plays these elaborate cat and mouse games with the police.
Yeah.
What does the actual data say about the intellect of real serial killers?
Yeah, we really need to hammer this point home because the data is pretty overwhelming on this. The vast majority of serial murderers are not criminal masterminds. They're just not geniuses. Typically, they are what the research calls street smart individuals, maybe, but with average or even lower than average intelligence. And often they're employed in, quite menial jobs.
So the profile is marked more by instability than by genius.
Precisely. Their behavioral profile is much more commonly marked by things like preoccupation, recklessness, deep insecurity, hostility, and really strong impulsivity. Statistically speaking, these are often men who are kind of recurrently in and out of jail or on community supervision. They're arguably less successful psychopaths who tend to rely more on brute force and seizing opportunities, not intricate cunning.
Okay, but if they're often this reckless and impulsive, how did so many manage to evade capture for so long, especially during that so-called golden age of serial murder we hear about?
Well, a lot of their perceived success back then often boiled down more to opportunity and just plain luck rather than brilliance. And the investigative data really confirms this lack of master planning. The source material points out that a staggering 72% of serial murderers,
72%? Wow.
72% were eventually captured because of descriptions provided by victims who survived, or by eyewitnesses who saw something, or even remarkably often by their own family members turning them in.
So not because some brilliant forensic expert finally cracked their complex, elaborate code.
Exactly. It wasn't usually like that at all. They are often caught just due to a stroke of chance, or they're simply, quote, unlucky in being apprehended after their initial crime. It's much less the silence of the lambs and much more the grim banality of impulse control failure and circumstance.
Okay, so we've firmly established that the typical serial killer is probably less like some refined evil genius and maybe more like an impulsive person, average intelligence, struggling with emotional regulation. Let's dig into the psychological traits that do seem to enable them to commit these horrific crimes. What are the common personality characteristics that keep showing up in the research?
Well, they certainly align very strongly with what we understand as psychopathic traits, regardless of their overall IQ. These typically include things like a kind of smooth-talking demeanor, a very egocentric and grandiose self-image. They feel entitled to whatever they want, and extremely manipulative behavior. They also tend to exhibit quite shallow, fleeting emotions and generally poor behavioral controls. Often, this seems fueled by a kind of deeply fragile masculinity or sense of inadequacy.
Hmm, that idea of a smooth-talking, manipulative person, it seems to clash a little with the reckless, impulsive profile you just described. How do they manage that in public? You often hear about the mask or the facade. They present this idea of impression management.
That facade is absolutely essential for many of them. This ability to act, beyond suspicion. It's a form of highly skilled impression management. It's what allows them to blend in socially, sometimes seamlessly. It often gets mischaracterized in popular culture as some unique feature of sociopathy, but honestly, it involves skills that many people, even successful people in everyday life, use to manage how they're perceived. For the killer, though, that facade has to hold up under much higher stakes.
Can you elaborate on just how effective that facade can be, based on the examples in the research, I mean?
Oh, the examples are chilling, really. Precisely because the facade was often so ordinary, so mundane. Think about John Wayne Gacy. He wasn't just some guy who dressed as a clown occasionally. He was involved in local politics. He was seen as a respected neighbor. That put him completely beyond suspicion for a long time. Right.
Or Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. He apparently sometimes brought his young son with him near crime scenes to appear more like a harmless, fatherly figure, disarming potential witnesses or victims.
Wow.
And Derek Todd Lee, the killer in Baton Rouge, he famously stayed on the loose partly because he was leading a Bible study group. It seems the deeper the darkness they harbor, sometimes the brighter the light they feel they need to project publicly.
That concept, that dual existence, the devoted father, the friendly neighbor, the church leader on one side, and the part-time killer on the other, it just sounds like it would create immense psychological stress, maybe cognitive dissonance. How do they manage that profound internal conflict without just shattering?
That's where the concept of compartmentalization comes in. The research strongly suggests that this mental process allows them to effectively wall off the killing part of their life from the rest of their moral and emotional landscape. It basically lets them kill without consciously experiencing the guilt or remorse most people would associate with such acts. And the sources use an analogy to help us understand this, right? To make it relatable.
They do, yeah. Compartmentalization isn't seen as something totally alien. It's viewed more as an extreme extension of a completely ordinary phenomenon we all engage in to some degree. Think of the analogy they use. A corporate executive who might be absolutely ruthless, maybe heartless, demanding at work, driving employees hard for profit,
Okay.
but then goes home and is a loving, gentle, completely devoted family man. They play two very conflicting roles, often quite seamlessly, by mentally separating them, keeping them in different boxes, essentially.
So the serial killer is just taking that much further, playing a third, much darker, much more violent role, but doing it part-time,
Yeah.
weaving it into their existing life structure.
Exactly. They somehow managed to fit their violent activities into a life that's already occupied by work, family, community obligations, whatever it is. They kill with selectivity, and then they return to their version of normalcy. But that compartmentalization, it's often aided by a second crucial psychological mechanism, one that specifically targets the victim: dehumanization.
Dehumanization, right? A cognitive tool that lets them basically deny the victim's humanity.
Yes, precisely. This is the capacity to start regarding the victim who they perceive as the other as something less than human, maybe as animals or demons or just filth. It renders the victim expendable in their mind. By viewing the victim as subhuman, the killer effectively eliminates any moral obligation they might feel to treat them as a person. The killing them becomes almost like a cleansing act, or simply the elimination of an object or an obstacle, which, again, aids the compartmentalization and shields them from guilt.
What are some of the specific, maybe starker examples of that kind of dehumanization that the researchers cited?
Well, the examples are often quite painful to hear, but they're crucial for understanding the mindset. They include things like viewing sex workers as nothing more than mere sex machines, or targeting gay victims perceived as AIDS carriers, or, in cases like some healthcare serial killers, regarding elderly or ill patients as just vegetables or filth that the world is somehow better off without. This kind of mental calculus is incredibly effective at dissolving empathy.
That brings us right to empathy itself,
Oh.
which is maybe one of the most misunderstood traits here. The public widely assumes, I think, that serial killers are just completely devoid of empathy. Full stop.
Hmm.
But the research you're citing shows it's, well, far too simplistic, especially when you look at the ones who are successful manipulators.
It is drastically oversimplified, yes. While one profile of sociopath, think of the Henry Lee Lucas type, often characterized by poor impulse control, lower IQ does typically display very low or even absent empathy. The more calculated, the more organized, sometimes the more sadistic offenders, they show a fundamentally different structure when it comes to empathy.
And you're referring here to the Theodore Bundy type.
Exactly. There was a key study by a researcher named Heilbrunn looking at male prisoners. He found this distinct group of sociopaths. They had better impulse control, often higher IQ, clearly sadistic objectives, who actually seemed to possess heightened cognitive empathy. And that's the crucial distinction you really need to grasp. They might lack affective empathy, the ability to actually feel what the victim feels, to share their emotions, but their cognitive empathy, which is the ability to understand what the victim is feeling, thinking, fearing, that can be highly tuned, almost like a skill.
So they aren't feeling the victim's pain. They're calculating the victim's pain and vulnerabilities.
Precisely. That cognitive understanding isn't a barrier to the crime, it's actually a necessary tool for manipulation. A killer who doesn't understand human sensitivities and fears would be pretty ineffective at luring and trapping victims, especially the wary ones. Theodore Bundy is the absolute textbook example of this. He clearly understood the compassion, the sensibilities of young college women. That's why he could effectively feign helplessness, using a fake cane or a cast, asking for help carrying books or loading something into his car to lure victims into his confidence. That requires a cold, intellectual, but nonetheless profound understanding of how people think and feel.
That distinction between the emotional lack and the cognitive understanding, it's really powerful. But it does beg the ultimate question, doesn't it? Where does this kind of psychological structure even come from? The age-old question, are serial killers born or are they made? How does modern forensic science try to synthesize the biological potential with the environmental reality?
Well, the consensus now, synthesizing across multiple sources, is really that the issue isn't about natural-born killers in the sense of destiny. It's more accurate to think in terms of natural-born potential killers. The foundation often seems to lie in certain biological predispositions, maybe neurological deficits, but whether that awful potential ever gets realized seems to depend overwhelmingly on environmental influences, particularly the presence or often the profound absence of things like love, affection, and stabilizing care, especially in early childhood.
Okay, let's start with that biological potential then. When researchers compare homicide offenders directly to other violent offenders who don't commit homicide, what specific structural differences are they finding in the brain?
Brain imaging studies have provided some really crucial data here. Homicide offenders, particularly those who engage in instrumental violence like serial murder, consistently show robust deficits, specifically reduced gray matter density in brain regions that are critical for things like executive functioning, moral decision-making, and emotional regulation.
Reduced gray matter density. Can you unpack that a bit, just so we're clear what that means?
Sure, think of gray matter as basically the brain's processing centers, the neurons and connections where the actual thinking and feeling happens. Reduced density means there are fewer functional neurons or perhaps fewer connections in those specific areas compared to average. The areas that researchers focus on most are primarily the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or VMPFC, and the orbitofrontal cortex, the OFC. You can kind of think of the orbitofrontal cortex as the brain's internal governor, or maybe its brake pedal.
Okay, the part that stops you from doing impulsive things.
Exactly. It's responsible for applying social and emotional restraint, for keeping impulses in check based on potential consequences. So a deficit there means that braking system is faulty. It can lead to more impulsive, reckless, and poorly judged decisions, less consideration for others.
And what about the other key brain areas that researchers often flag in these studies?
They also often show reductions in places like the anterior temporal cortex, the insula, and the cingulate cortex. These are also vital areas. The insula and cingulate cortex, for instance, are heavily involved in processing emotions and developing self-awareness. When these areas are compromised, you often see impaired behavioral control and an increase in psychopathic traits. These structural deficits seem consistently more pronounced in those who commit planned, instrumental violence like serial murder compared to other violent criminals.
So beyond the physical structure, the brain's chemical environment must play a role too, right? What are the key neurochemical factors involved, particularly thinking about serotonin?
Yes, serotonin is definitely highly implicated. It's a neurotransmitter that plays a huge role in regulating mood, aggression, and impulsivity. Generally speaking, low levels of serotonin activity in the brain are widely associated with both reactive aggression, that's the quick, explosive, heat of the moment type, and also with instrumental aggression, the more planned, premeditated kind. And just general impulsivity, too.
Okay, that seems fairly straightforward. Low serotonin could mean more aggression, more risk-taking.
You'd think so. But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is what some researchers call the serotonin paradox. They've also found that low activity of a specific gene, the MAOA gene, that stands for monoamine oxidase A, is also linked to increased reactive aggression and criminal behavior.
Okay, MAOA, what does that enzyme do?
MAOA is basically part of the brain's cleanup crew for certain neurotransmitters, including serotonin. It breaks them down after they've done their job. So if you have low activity of the MAOA gene, it means that cleanup crew is slow, it's inefficient, and the result is actually higher sustained levels of serotonin and other neurotransmitters like dopamine and norepinephrine lingering in the synapse.
Wait a minute, so low serotonin is linked to aggression, but having this gene variation that leads to higher serotonin is also linked to aggression. That sounds completely contradictory.
It does. It really complicates the simple low serotonin equals aggression picture. What it strongly suggests is that the issue might not just be about the sheer volume of serotonin, high or low, but rather about poor regulation. It seems when you combine a genetic predisposition like this low MAOA activity with severe childhood stress or abuse, the brain's whole chemical signaling system becomes dysregulated. It makes that individual far more susceptible to developing patterns of explosive, violent, and antisocial behavior later on.
Fascinating. Are there other biological markers that seem to contribute to this underlying potential for violence?
Yes, a couple of others are often noted. One is low autonomic arousal. Basically, this means the individual's baseline level of physiological arousal, heart rate, skin conductance is lower than average. They might need more external stimulation than the average person just to feel, well, normal or engaged. This can drive them towards seeking out dangerous, risky, highly stimulating behaviors, a craving that, in the extreme, might eventually be satisfied by the intense risk and power involved in violent crime.
Like a thrill-seeking component pushed to the extreme.
Exactly. And the other marker often mentioned is low cortisol levels. Cortisol is a primary stress hormone. Having chronically low levels has also been associated with a greater tolerance for stress, less fear of punishment, and increased aggressive behavior.
Okay, so that paints a picture of the potential biological hardware, maybe the chemical software. How do environmental factors then act as the catalyst? What turns this underlying potential into the horrifying reality of a serial killer?
Trauma. Overwhelmingly, the research points to trauma, particularly early life trauma, as the essential catalyst. It's what seems to ignite the fuse. One major study, for instance, found that a clear majority of the serial killers they examined, a staggering 68%, had suffered some form of significant maltreatment, including physical abuse, sexual abuse, or severe neglect during their childhood.
And this echoes the biographies of so many of the infamous cases we know about.
Absolutely. You think of someone like Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. He endured severe physical abuse as a child, had multiple serious head injuries, possibly contributing to his later development of epilepsy, and certainly his subsequent violent sadistic behaviors. Or Jeffrey Dahmer, whose family life was described as highly dysfunctional, deeply marked by his mother's severe mental illness and periods of depression. An early life that's essentially devoid of reliable love, consistent affection, and basic care seems to create this devastating scenario where the developing brain, which might already be biologically compromised, fails to establish normal emotional attachments or internalize moral boundaries.
What about early behavioral signs? Are there specific flags that consistently emerge in childhood histories?
Well, the classic indicators often get grouped together, sometimes maybe too simplistically, in what used to be called the McDonald triad, though researchers now caution that this triad alone isn't necessarily predictive. But it includes things like a history of animal torture or cruelty, persistent fire setting, and chronic bedwetting well past an age where it's considered normal.
Right, those three often come up.
Yeah. Additionally, you often find that many of these individuals were victims themselves in childhood, maybe severely bullied, sometimes relentlessly, perhaps due to physical characteristics like being short or having a stammer. This can lead to these deep-seated feelings of inadequacy, intense resentment, and eventually a powerful consuming desire for revenge or absolute control later in life. And interest in voyeurism also sometimes appears early on.
And cognitive factors like IQ, does that play a role in predicting risk as well?
It seems to, yes. Lower IQ scores, particularly when it comes to verbal intelligence, are pretty consistently identified as a risk factor for general delinquency and developing antisocial behavior patterns. The thinking is, if a child struggles to express themselves adequately using words, or finds it hard to cognitively process complex social situations and navigate conflicts verbally, they might be more likely to resort to physical or aggressive means to solve problems or express their frustration.
Okay, so that psychological profile you've detailed, often impulsive, average intelligence, maybe a high trauma history that's essential context. But the profile of the active killer seems to be changing, or at least different from the stereotype. Those famous Golden Age killers from the 70s and 80s, they were largely white males, often operating across state lines. What does the demographic data from more recent cases, say specifically from 2017 to 2022, tell us about the modern serial killer?
Yeah, the profile has shifted quite significantly in recent years, really challenging those old persistent stereotypes. The current statistical picture, based on that recent data, is often a black male, usually operating locally, often motivated by revenge. They tend to start their series relatively young, typically between the ages of 21 and 30, and importantly, they're often killing fewer victims, maybe two, and doing so in a shorter time frame, often less than a year.
That shorter duration and lower victim count, that ties right back to the newer definition we talked about earlier with the two-victim threshold, and it implies the pace can be quite rapid.
It often is, yes. And it also links strongly to their criminal history. There's a very significant criminal history factor in these recent cases. These offenders are frequently found to be recurrently involved with the criminal justice system, maybe recently released from jail or currently under community supervision. And there's a very high rate of prior convictions for intimate partner violence. So the picture is often of generally local, maybe undereducated men operating with a degree of recklessness, often with easy access to weapons. Firearms are overwhelmingly the most common weapon now, and using murder not necessarily as some refined sadistic ritual, but maybe as a more direct, violent, easily accessible means to achieve power or enact revenge quickly.
Interesting. I definitely want to spend some time on the gender differences here, too.
Hmm.
Female serial killers were, for a long time, largely excluded from research, which must have left a huge gap in our understanding.
Hmm.
What are the key distinctions researchers have found between male and female serial murderers?
That's a crucial area. While male serial killers, as we've discussed, overwhelmingly tend to kill for motives related to sex, sadistic pleasure, or exerting power and control over the victim during the act. The research strongly indicates that women who commit serial murder kill predominantly for different reasons, typically for money and power. But it's often power over their environment, their situation, or maybe an institution they're part of, rather than sexual control over the victim.
Okay, money and situational power, that implies a major difference in their methods, too, I'd imagine.
It does, generally speaking. Female serial killers often differ quite markedly in their methods and victim selection. They frequently target people they know, intimates, family members, or sometimes vulnerable individuals under their care, like patients or the elderly. They also tend to rely on more subtle methods, things like poison or drug overdoses, to subdue or kill their victims, rather than overt violence. And perhaps most interestingly, they often kill over significantly longer periods, sometimes years or even decades, compared to their male counterparts. This really suggests a more calculated, purpose-oriented motive, maybe systematically eliminating obstacles, collecting insurance money or inheritances, rather than the more spontaneous, often sexually charged impulses that seem to drive many male killers.
That calculation, that targeting of vulnerable people under their care, it brings us directly to the really unique and frankly terrifying threat posed by healthcare serial killers, people like Donald Harvey, for example. How do they manage to exploit the trust that's inherent in that setting?
The healthcare setting, unfortunately, provides an almost perfect environment for this specific type of predation. The patient-practitioner relationship is built fundamentally on trust, which creates profound vulnerability for the patient. Healthcare professionals obviously have intimate knowledge of life and death processes, and they have crucial, often unsupervised, access to the tools of the trade, things like paralytic drugs, lethal doses of medication. And perhaps most critically, death is often anticipated in settings like hospitals or nursing homes. It's expected. This means that even a statistically suspicious number of deaths might garner very little scrutiny initially, allowing the pattern to continue undetected for longer.
And what's the psychological payoff for them? What's the motivation?
Their motivations seem strongly tied to feelings of power and control, often described as playing God. Donald Harvey, for instance, explicitly confessed that he enjoyed having the ultimate control, deciding whether people lived or died. In other cases, the motivation might be tied to things like a desire for attention, the Munchausen syndrome by proxy dynamic, or maybe just the thrill of fooling everyone around them, reinforcing their own grandiose psychopathic self-image.
Right. Okay, finally in this section, let's look at the actual forensic behavior specifically. What happens to the victim's body? The media, the movies, they always seem to show meticulous transportation, concealment, maybe elaborate burial. What do the hard data actually show about how bodies are most commonly disposed of?
Yeah, the reality, according to the research, is far less sophisticated than that common media narrative. When researchers analyzed, I think it was 480 victims in one major study on body disposal. The most common scenario, by a significant margin occurring in a striking 43.8% of the cases, is when the body is simply left as is at the murder site.
Just left as is. Wow. That flies directly in the face of the whole mastermind myth we started talking about.
It really does. It confirms again that a large portion of these offenders are likely acting recklessly, impulsively. Transporting and effectively concealing a body is a high-risk, time-consuming additional step that requires planning and effort. The fact that nearly half the time they don't do it suggests they're often not taking those extra forensic precautions. Furthermore, some studies suggest a psychological distinction here too. Murderers who didn't conceal their victims tended to have significantly higher mean anger scores. So concealment might be driven more by fear of discovery, while leaving the body in place could be a sign of recklessness, high anger during the crime, or maybe even a purely sadistic act where displaying the body as part of the power trip, prioritizing that over self-preservation.
So we've established that the historical killer often relied heavily on situational luck, opportunity, maybe recklessness. This brings us to a really significant trend: the substantial documented global decline in serial murder rates over the last few decades.
Yes, that's absolutely right. The period roughly from 1950 to 2000, those were really the deadliest years for this type of crime. But since the 1990s, there has been a really dramatic confirmed global decline. Researchers now confidently talk about the epidemic's end, and the numbers are quite encouraging. The average number of victims per identified offender dropped significantly, from around 13 back in the 1980s down to just 3 in the 2000s. Killers are simply being apprehended much, much earlier in their criminal careers now.
So what was that sort of perfect storm, that confluence of situational factors that allowed those Golden Age serial murderers, or GSMs as some researchers call them, to operate with such relative impunity during that peak period, say from the mid-60s to about 1990?
It really was a kind of perfect storm of anonymity and access back then. You had the relatively new interstate highway system, which allowed for constant, easy, anonymous travel across state lines, making it hard to connect crimes in different jurisdictions to one suspect. You had the widespread popularity of hitchhiking, which sadly provided incredibly easy, low-risk access to potential victims. Parental monitoring of children and teens was generally less intense than today, and critically, tracking technologies were minimal to non-existent. No cell phones, very few surveillance cameras.
And police communication wasn't great between jurisdictions either.
Exactly. Police forces often struggled to share data effectively or quickly across different city, county, or state networks. It created gaps for offenders to slip through.
And now, most of those enabling factors have been largely neutralized, mainly by technology and more interconnected policing.
Absolutely. The decline is directly attributable in large part to the rise of what you might call the heavily surveilled society. We have the proliferation of tracking technology everywhere. Cellular phones are essentially massive tracking devices we all carry. There are ubiquitous surveillance cameras on streets, in businesses, and police forces now have the ability to share data almost instantly across states and even internationally. Investigators are just far better prepared and far more networked than they were 40 or 50 years ago.
This increased preparedness also extends to solving old cases, cold cases, which the sources highlight as being a really crucial preventative measure in itself. Why is clearing cold cases considered so vital, even if the likely offender is already in prison for something else or maybe even deceased?
Because offenders, especially those with fixed patterns driven by psychopathic traits, they tend to repeat their crimes if given the opportunity. So, by retroactively solving an old case, maybe from decades ago, and definitively linking it to a specific offender, you not only achieve justice for that victim and their family, but you potentially disrupt a violent cycle that could have claimed future victims had they remained free. Plus, think about it. If an offender committed a crime back in, say, 1985, but was only caught for unrelated crimes in 2005, solving that 1985 case ensures that the victim's data is correctly recorded and linked. It prevents future investigative errors if similar cases pop up.
Makes sense. What specific advancements have proven most impactful in tackling these cold cases,
Yeah.
especially when you're talking about overcoming decades of time?
Well, DNA technology is obviously paramount. It's been the single biggest game changer, and the techniques are constantly evolving, becoming more sensitive. Programs funded by organizations like the National Institute of Justice, such as their Solving Cold Cases with DNA initiative, have resulted in the resolution of literally thousands of previously unsolved cases. We have incredibly powerful examples of how this technology transcends time. It was advanced DNA testing that finally confirmed the identity of Albert DeSalvo as the Boston Strangler decades after his death, bringing some closure to those cases.
And the technology now allows for resolution even without a perfect DNA match from the offender themselves, right? I'm thinking of familial DNA searching.
Exactly. Familial DNA searching, that's the process of identifying potential suspects by finding partial matches between crime scene DNA and close relatives who might be in existing offender or genealogy databases. That is proving to be a massive game changer for cold cases. The John Bittroff case in New York is a key example. He was convicted based largely on a partial DNA match to his brother in the state database. It allowed investigators to narrow down their focus from potentially millions to just a small family pool of previously unknown suspects.
That's incredibly efficient. There are also these sort of knock-on efficiency benefits that extend beyond just solving the original crime, aren't there?
Definitely. Solving one complex serial case often ends up resolving multiple other cases, sometimes inadvertently. It creates a kind of economy of scale for investigations. When authorities were intensely focused on identifying the remaining unknown victims of John Wayne Gacy, for instance, that massive, painstaking investigation ended up inadvertently clearing, I think it was 11 other entirely unrelated missing persons cases from the books, several of which turned out to be homicides committed by other people. The level of technology combined with the sophisticated information exchange now available really provides law enforcement with the best opportunity in history to start addressing the huge backlog and ongoing crisis of unresolved homicides.
That really brings us full circle, doesn't it? We started this deep dive by pushing back against the media's often simplistic, sensationalized narrative of the serial killer. And we've ended up with a far more complex, nuanced, but ultimately maybe more actionable understanding, one that's deeply rooted in decades of psychological research and forensic science.
Yeah, I think if we synthesize what we've really unpacked here, the modern understanding of a serial killer is far less like the calculated, brilliant movie mastermind, and far more often someone who is perhaps undereducated, operates with recklessness, and is driven by these deep-seated psychological needs and deficits, often rooted in complex developmental issues and maybe even brain function differences.
Yeah.
Their historical success, particularly during that mid to late 20th century peak, seems to have been built very heavily on situational opportunities, anonymity, access, lack of technology that our current, highly surveilled, technologically advanced society has now largely eliminated. So, what does all this mean for the future of criminology and investigation? If researchers have moved beyond simply reacting to the horrific crime after it happens and are starting to get a better handle on the psychological and even biological ingredients that might create a potential killer, where does the investigation go next? What's the frontier? Well, the final frontier, arguably, is shifting towards prevention. And a key part of that involves increasingly sophisticated digital forensics moving into the digital realm to try and identify potential pre-attack behaviors. We are starting to learn how to potentially identify the development of a violent cycle before the first murder even occurs by looking at digital footprints.
Pre-attack behaviors.
Sure.
Okay. What specifically are investigators starting to look for in someone's digital footprint that might signal imminent violence or a developing plan?
It seems to involve identifying patterns of intense, escalating obsession, things like repeated, highly specific online searches for certain victim characteristics or vulnerabilities, maybe sustained voyeuristic engagement with specific social media profiles over time, or evidence of repeated digital tracking of potential victims' daily routines or locations. These kinds of sustained, focused digital patterns could potentially indicate that an individual is moving beyond passive fantasy and actively into the planning stages that a violent cycle is dangerously developing.
And here's where it gets really fascinating and maybe ethically complex. This is something for you, the listener, to really mull over. If modern research using digital forensics and behavioral science can potentially start to reliably identify these developing pre-attack behaviors in the digital realm, actions and patterns that clearly precede a crime that hasn't actually happened yet. What are the profound ethical and practical implications of using these digital patterns for early intervention? It completely shifts the focus, doesn't it? From hunting the killer after the fact to potentially identifying the risk, the potential for violence, in time to somehow disrupt that cycle before that first murder is ever committed.
That potential for preemptive intervention based on this convergence of psychological understanding and digital data analysis, that really is the defining and incredibly challenging question for the next generation of forensic science and public safety policy.